All right, so I'm Josh Schwartz. I'm the chief data scientist at Chartbeat. And tonight I'm going to be talking about something that's very off sort of our product roadmap. I'm going to be talking about some research that we've been doing lately, trying to understand the relationship between how people consume content, so how people read web pages, and how the ads on those pages should be valued. And let me run back over here. So before I do that, let me give a quick background on Chartbeat for those of you who don't know us. So we've been around for about 5 years. We're based in New York. The primary thing that we make is a suite of software that does analytics for editors at major media companies. So an editor at the New York Times or Al Jazeera or the BBC or CNN or so on and so on sits around all day with our dashboard open, sort of using our product to understand how traffic is flowing around their site. We work with many of the biggest publishers in the world, and also thousands and thousands of smaller sites from across the world. And one interesting thing which has happened over the past few years is the metrics that people have used to understand traffic on the web have changed as sort of applications on the web have changed. So if this were 2-3 years ago, we would have talked about traffic on a site in terms of the number of page views that site got. So we'd say something like, okay, well, an average person that hits this site is consuming 3.5 pages across their visit, and maybe 1 million people visit the site across a month, right? The problem with that is that when we deal with sites that are more of applications, the notion of a page stops making sense, right? So if you think about something like Facebook, I go to Facebook, I have one single kind of load of a page, and then you spend 45 minutes reading and consuming, or maybe I watch a live stream on a site where I spend 30 minutes watching a video, and from the perspective of just the number of page loads, I'm not able to distinguish that sort of behavior from a person sort of just browsing a page, just opening an article, reading the first paragraph, and leaving. So what we'd like to be able to do is come up with metrics which could sort of disambiguate those two. And the way that that's gone for us and for most other analytics companies in the world is thinking about traffic in terms of the time that people are spending actually consuming the content on the pages. So saying that, sort of in the examples that I gave, saying a person spent 30 minutes consuming this page rather than saying a person consumed 3 pages, right? Now, how do we actually do that? Well, what happens is basically, while a person is browsing a page, we have JavaScript on the page, and we're sort of continually taking measurements, millisecond by millisecond. And what we get out are, and here are sort of 2 examples of information. So what we get out is a stream of at every millisecond when a user was active. So here, if you can sort of make out the colors, we have a stream of every mouse movement, every click, every scroll, and whatnot, so that we can understand a user's activity while they're browsing the page. We also, on the right, can understand where a user is spending time when they're on the page. So, in this case, this red is denoting a user who spent most of their time, 1,000 pixels down the page. The blue is saying that, okay, so they saw that part of the page, but they scrolled down very quickly. So we can track the time that they're consuming for, and then sort of where, in terms of the geometry of the page, that time is spent. So I promised that this talk would be about sort of measuring ads, and I haven't talked about ads yet. So let me talk about ads for a second. So just like I said, the measurements that we've used for content online have typically been these kind of antiquated measurements of how many people, how many page views. Ads are kind of stuck in the same boat. So although there's been a huge amount of progress in figuring out how to target ads, how to run efficient auctions and whatnot, the actual metrics that people are using to measure campaigns and to transact on are still very simple, right? So they're basically equivalent to the page view. There are 2 main ways that you sort of transact on ads. One is you have what probably most people who don't work in the advertising world think of, which is what's called performance-based advertising. So advertising where you're pricing on a click or some other activity. Right? Now, that advertising makes a lot of sense, if I'm, whatever product you looked at last night on Amazon, and now when you're browsing the internet, you see that product again, and the goal of that ad is to get you to click that ad, make the purchase immediately. And so it completely makes sense to sort of reward the site if they show you that ad and they make the purchase. On the other hand, if you think about something like browsing the New York Times and seeing Tiffany's ads, Tiffany doesn't think that you're gonna click through and buy a ring right then, right? In fact, that's not really the desired use case at all. What they think is that by sort of being in front of you while you're going about your day, they're sort of bringing their brand to kind of the top of your mind. And it turns out that around a third of ads across the internet are sold in that way. And so that's sort of, that mechanism is called pricing on impression, which says that you're paying just for the number of times that the ad loads in front of people, right? Now, the thing about impression-based advertising is that it reminds us a lot of page views, right? Because impression-based advertising is basically just pricing on ad loads. And that's not a bad way to measure. But on the other hand, it's trying to proxy for attention, right? It's trying to say how, okay, well, this ad loaded 10 times in front of a person, so they sort of spent 10 loads in front of this ad. But it doesn't capture the fact that, let's say, there's a huge distinction between, let's say, the top banner ad that I saw for 1 second and then scrolled down the page and didn't see again. Or the ad at the bottom of the page that I never read down far enough to actually see, but loaded just fine. Or the video pre-roll ad that I spent 30 seconds looking at and actually watching. And sort of, if we just think about like this sort of binary value of did the ad load or not, none of those sort of subtleties are captured. But the interesting thing is that with the data that we're collecting about how people are browsing the page, we understand how people are browsing with the ads in view, and so how people are consuming, and we understand that that banner at the top was seen for 1 second, and this thing at the bottom wasn't seen at all. So the question is, it's kind of obvious why that sort of pixel by pixel browsing behavior is useful when you're an editor, right? When you're an editor, you sort of intuitively want to know, are people hitting my page and reading it or not, right? Where are they spending their time? But for an ad, it shouldn't be intuitively clear that that sort of data would be meaningful, right? Because if you think about what that sort of second by second analysis tells you is, it tells you how people were spending time around the ads, right? But when I'm consuming a page, my consumption of the ad is kind of incidental, right? Like I'm trying to read the content on the page, and there's just an ad that happens to be in view. And so it's not intuitively clear, at least to me, that the time that the ad is passively in view should actually matter in terms of the effectiveness of the ad. So we wanted to test this hypothesis to see if this is true. And so what we did is we put together a series of just large-scale lab studies, right? So we did 3 of them. They all kind of take the same format, which is as follows. You take a set of participants. We put about 1,500 people in each study. And you tell them, I'm paying you to read this article. What I want you to do is read this article, and I'm going to ask you questions about this article when you're done. And in the background, we're recording kind of this millisecond by millisecond data of what they're doing on the article. And after they're reading it for a while, we basically wipe the screen. We flip it to blank. After some number of seconds, we'll call it n, right? So after n seconds, we wipe the screen. And now we ask them a question. We say, okay, what was the content on the page, the survey that we told them we were going to give them, and to make sure that they actually read the page. And then we also say, hey, by the way, there were ads on that page. We didn't mention them before, but do you happen to know anything about them? And what we test for are basically 2 metrics. One of them is what's called brand recall or ad recall, which is what's the probability that a person is actually able to recall what the brand of the ad was. So we say, did you just see a Toyota ad or a Honda ad? The other is what's called ad recognition, which is you sort of show people 2 ads and say, which one of these did you see? Which one of these did you see? And then what we asked is, as we varied that n, so as we varied the exposure that people had to the ads, did their ability to recall and recognize the ads change? The interesting thing is that it mattered a lot, right? So this is data from one of our studies. What we see is, so on the x-axis, we have the time that people saw the ad for, and on the y-axis we have their ability to recall the brand of the ad, right? And you see that there's just a really clear increase, and this is a multi-thousand person study, so it's just super clear that there's a trend. And the interesting thing, which I want to stress here because it's so rare that you get to say this, is that this is a causative relationship, right? Because we're not sort of passively measuring how people were exposed. We're randomly selecting people and changing only one variable, which is the amount of time they see the ad for, and seeing whether controlling that one variable affects their ability to recall the ad. So this is actually something where we're able to pull out causation, which is pretty cool. So yeah, like I said, it turns out that time matters. It also turns out that before you spend $1,000 doing a study, you should do some thorough research on what the literature looks like when you're dealing with a subject that you don't know anything about. And so it turns out that some folks from Microsoft Research had done a similar study about a year before we did it, and then came out with another study sort of contemporaneously that basically looked at exactly the same thing. They took a couple thousand people, they showed them ads, they varied the time they were seeing them and all that. They did a few variations, they're a little bit different, but they found exactly the same thing. So what we see here are their curves of sort of on the left, this is the recall curve, on the right it's the recognition curve. In both cases you see that there's a clear trend, whereas people see ads for longer, they're able to recall them more. So the really neat thing about finding this research is that it shows that there's actually, I feel like a biologist or something in that, like, there's actually scientific consensus, right? I'm used to the machine learning world where, like, every paper is something different, and in this case, we actually sort of two separate research groups acting independently, running their own experiments, found exactly the same trend, which is pretty exciting. So this tells us something about maybe how ads might be valued on time. It tells us something about, well, maybe a 20-second ad is worth 30% more than a 10-second ad because it has a 30% sort of higher effect according to these lab studies. Now, the next question you should probably ask is, well, how long are ads actually seen for in the wild? Here we were sort of controlling them. So are these sort of differences actually things that matter to how kind of the economy of advertising might work? It turns out that, yes, it should matter, right? So what we see here is this is a distribution across a few dozen sites. It looks different for different sites. But this is a distribution of how many impressions are served and seen for different amounts of time, right? So what we see is that the majority of ads are seen for a short period of time, 1 to 5 seconds, right? But on the other hand, there's a sort of fat enough tail that, let's say that 11 plus second ads should be worth more than 1 to 5 second ads. There's a fat enough tail that matters, right? We're talking about, a substantial number of impressions, especially when we scale it up to the web, that maybe actually should be valued differently than the majority of impressions. The other interesting thing is that this is kind of, if you think about it, this is the distribution across a number of sites. The next question that you should ask is, does the market sort of already price for this somehow, right? So this is data that we sort of pulled in our analysis, and nobody else has data exactly like this, but maybe somehow the market has corrected for it already. The answer is no. Right? So if you plot out on the x-axis, you plot out the time that ads were seen. On the y-axis, you plot out what the CPM is. It looks like it looks like noise. There's just no relationship between the two. It also turns out that if anything, the ads that people treat as most premium are often the ads that get the least amount of time. Right? So typically the ads that if you're an advertiser, you sort of have this tendency to want to pay the most amount of money for are the top banners on the homepage of whatever site it is, right? And that seems like a great position because your ad is right next to the banner of the site that people want to go to and all that. It's on the homepage where you know that a lot of people go. But the downside of it is that the second somebody hits the page, they scroll down and the ad is out of view, let's say before the page loads or after 1 second of being viewed. And so what we have here is at the top, we're showing kind of that histogram that I was showing before, but blown out into looking at it second by second. And what we're seeing is the number of impressions for sort of what are typically looked at as the high-value slots. And what we see is that there's this huge sort of left bias, right? So in these typical sort of top banner positions, many of the impressions are seen for 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, whatever. And very few of them are seen in this sort of long fat tail. Right? On the other hand, if you actually buy ads, ironically, in the positions which are hardest for people to sell, So typically those are, the ad that's in the middle of the content, right? For some reason, that's always been hard for premium publishers to sell. And the interesting thing is that those, if you buy an ad right there, this is what the distribution of time looks like, right? You get a ton of time because if you think about it, when a person is reading, they're spending a ton of, maybe you spend 20, 30, 40 seconds reading a specific part of the page while an ad is in view there. And so the neat thing about this data is that I think it's something which is potentially a really valuable sort of direction of research, both on the advertiser side and on the sort of the publisher kind of supply side, right? So if you think about it from the perspective of an advertiser maybe can make more intelligent buys, right? I mean, there's kind of no sense in which having more information would be bad for the advertiser, right? If they can choose, I think that this is an ad which deserves a 5-second slot versus a 10-second slot, that completely makes sense for the advertiser side. The interesting thing is that it also has a potential to have huge effect on the publisher side, because publishers, like I said, have traditionally had real problems sort of justifying, let's say, to use a kind of synthetic example, I'm the New York Times, I have a hard time selling, my premium content, right? If you're a premium publisher, you're constantly trying to justify the fact that you should spend more to advertise on my site, right? And one way that this data suggests you might be able to justify that is by saying that, well, when you advertise next to the content that people really want to read, they spend more time reading it, your ads get seen for longer, that actually has an effect. So I'm basically going to leave it at that. I hope that this talk asked more questions than it answered. That's kind of the goal of it. I'll leave you with a couple of open questions that I think are really interesting for further research. So one question is there's been a ton of research across the sort of, at least dozens of years of sort of marketing research that says that when you're thinking about kind of ad on the impression by impression level, that talks about the number of impressions that a person should be exposed to, right? So there are these things where a marketing scientist will say, okay, you want your brand to be seen at least 7 times or 5 times or whatever the number is in order to have it sort of stick in somebody's memory. And if we're going to move toward a world where ads are sort of thought about in terms of time, we need to sort of replicate that research. So the Microsoft research guys have done a little bit of work on this, sort of comparing small, short impressions to single, longer impressions. But there's a lot of stuff left to be done that I think is really interesting. The other question, which I kind of halfway wonder if somebody in the room is an economist and just knows the answer, right, so if you do, talk to me after. So we sort of showed those curves that talk about what the kind of demand should be, right? So that a 20-second impression is worth this much more in terms of recall, in terms of its effect, than a 10-second impression. We also showed those curves for a given site of what the supply looks like, right? So we know that 20-second impressions maybe are really scarce and 10-second impressions maybe are less scarce, something like that. And so the question is just what's the right way to sort of mix those two together? What does an efficient pricing scheme look like? So with that, I'll leave it there and take questions.
Thank you very much. We actually have time just literally for one question. So I guess, Dan, whoever you're closest to. But you're going to be around after this, right, Josh?
Yeah.
Okay,
well.
so you'll be able to.
Hi, I'm Rob Campos, and I work at Viviki for Publicis Group. Is this, on the ad side, is this product something that you're looking for publishers for tier 1, tier 2 kind of inventory, or is this also going to be something that you're going to use to qualify remnant inventory for programmatic?
I think it's a great question. I mean, so the place we operate in sort of the premium publisher space as a company. So when I'm looking at data, I'm exclusively looking at sort of premium publisher data. I have no sense of what true remnant inventory looks like. So just to be clear for anybody who doesn't know, remnant inventory is that sort of like you're browsing a web forum and there's an ad kind of following you around. That's what remnant is versus like you're reading, Bloomberg, you're reading the New York Times, and you're seeing ads there. Those things are sold differently. I think it's really interesting on both. I think that there's potentially some really interesting arbitrage to be done in the remnant space because if you can buy ads at sort of remnant prices and find out that actually you're buying ads that are seen that are sort of getting premium exposure. That's really cool. But the space that I'm most familiar with is the premium publisher space.
Thank you, Josh. That's terrific. Thank you.
Thanks.